Welcome back. Tonight, we'll take a calm journey through history. Settle in and let the story begin. In the centuries between the years 800 and 1400, across the gentle landscapes of Europe, life moved with the unhurried rhythm of seasons and sunlight. This is not a tale of kings or conquests, but of the soft sounds that filled ordinary days, the whisper of grain beneath a millstone, the gentle lowing of cattle at dusk, the quiet prayers spoken in stone chapels as candles flickered against ancient walls. Picture, if you will, a world without the rush of modern time. A world measured not in minutes or seconds, but in the arc of the sun across the sky, the growing cycle of wheat and barley, the slow turn of water wheels beside clear-running streams. Here, in these quiet centuries, people lived lives of simple repetition, finding comfort in the familiar patterns that their parents and grandparents had known before them. The villages of medieval Europe nestled into the landscape as naturally as the trees and streams that surrounded them. Small clusters of timber-framed houses with thatched roofs gathered around a central green, a church, and perhaps a manor house. Smoke rose from cooking fires in thin, lazy spirals. Gardens stretched behind each dwelling, neat patches of herbs and vegetables tended with patient care. Beyond the villages lay the open fields, divided into long strips where families cultivated their portions of land. These fields changed color with the seasons, the fresh green of spring growth, the golden waves of summer grain, the brown earth of autumn plowing, the white silence of winter snow. Between the fields, narrow paths wound through the landscape, connecting village to village, farm to mill, home to church. The forest stood at the edges of cleared land, ancient and deep. These were not frightening places in daylight hours, but sources of fuel, food, and building materials. People knew these woods intimately, where the best mushrooms grew, which trees provided the straightest timber, where streams ran clear and cold. In this world, time itself felt different. The day began when the rooster crowed and the first gray light appeared in the eastern sky. It ended when darkness made work impossible and families gathered around their hearths. The year turned on the great wheel of seasons and saints' days, each festival marking another passage in the eternal cycle of planting and harvest, death and renewal. Let us step into this quieter world now, leaving behind the hurry of our modern age. We will walk through these medieval days slowly, noticing the small details, the texture of rough wool beneath working hands, the smell of bread baking in clay ovens, the sound of bells calling across fields at evening time. There is no urgency here, no destination we must reach. We are simply observing, remembering, and perhaps finding in these ancient rhythms a peace that still resonates across the centuries. As dawn approaches in our medieval village, the world rests in that special stillness that comes just before first light. The stars are fading. The darkness is not yet black, but deepening blue. In the houses, families sleep on straw mattresses beneath woolen blankets. The fire in each hearth has burned down to embers, glowing softly in the darkness. Soon, someone will rise to coax those embers back to flame, but for now, all is still. This is where our journey begins, in the peaceful darkness before dawn, when the medieval world holds its breath before beginning another day. The village of Ashford stood in a shallow valley, where a stream ran clear over smooth stones. 40 families made their homes here, living in houses built of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung that dried hard as stone. The roofs were thick thatch, golden when newly laid, darkening to gray-brown with age and weather. Each house consisted of a single large room where the family lived, cooked, ate, and slept. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes that could be swept out and replaced when they grew too soiled. A hearth sat in the center or against one wall, its smoke finding its way out through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. Windows were small, often just openings that could be shuttered against cold and rain. Glass was a luxury known only to churches and the very wealthy. Behind each dwelling stretched a long, narrow plot of land called a toft. Here families kept their kitchen gardens, growing onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, and herbs. A small structure might house a few chickens or a pig. Apple and pear trees provided fruit in their season. Women tended these gardens with daily care, knowing that what grew here would supplement the bread and pottage that formed the basis of every meal. The village arranged itself around the church, which stood at the center like a stone mother hen. Built of local gray stone, St. Mary's was the largest and most permanent structure in Ashford. Its square tower could be seen from the fields all around, a landmark and a comfort. Inside, the church was dim and cool even on summer days. The smell of old incense lingered in the air. A few benches lined the walls, but most people stood during services. The floor was paved with worn stones that bore the scratched marks of builders long dead. Beside the church stood the priest's house, slightly larger than the villagers' homes and built with more care. Father Benedict had served Ashford for 20 years, a mild-mannered man who knew every family, baptized every child, blessed every marriage, and buried every dead. His Latin was good, his voice gentle, his life simple. He rose each morning to say the office of lauds, whether anyone else attended or not. The rhythm of the church's prayers marked his days as surely as the sun marked the hours. The manor house sat on a slight rise at the village's northern edge. It was timber-built, like the other structures, but larger, with 2 stories and several rooms. The lord of the manor, Sir William de Clare, was often away on business, but his wife, Lady Eleanor, managed the estate with quiet efficiency. The manor's great hall had a proper chimney, a rare luxury. In winter, the lord's family and their servants gathered there in the evenings, sharing the warmth of a large fire. Between the houses ran lanes of packed earth that turned to mud in rain. Children and chickens shared these spaces during the day. Dogs slept in patches of sun. Cats kept the mouse population under control. The village green provided common space where geese grazed and where, on feast days, people gathered for simple entertainments. At the village edge stood the mill, a sturdy building of stone and timber where the stream had been diverted to turn a great wooden wheel. The steady splash and rumble of the wheel turning was a constant sound, day and night when water flowed strong. Inside, massive millstones ground wheat and barley into flour. The miller, Thomas Whitbread, was a prosperous man by village standards. Every family needed their grain ground, and the miller took a portion of each grinding as his fee. His hands and clothes were always dusted with fine white flour. He had the satisfied look of a man whose services were essential. The blacksmith's forge occupied another important place in village life. Here, iron was heated to red and orange glow and shaped on the anvil with ringing hammer blows. The blacksmith, John Harrow, was a thick-armed man with a solemn face. He made and mended everything: iron plowshares, horseshoes, nails, hinges, cooking pots, and sometimes, when called upon, the occasional sword or dagger for the manor. The forge was always warm, the smith always busy. In winter, people found excuses to linger near the forge, warming themselves by its heat. Most families in Ashford worked the land. They held their strips in the common fields by custom and agreement, owing certain days of labor on the lord's demesne land, in exchange for the right to farm their own portions. This was the feudal arrangement that structured rural life throughout medieval Europe, a web of mutual obligations and customary rights that bound lord and peasant in an ancient pattern. The rhythm of village life followed patterns set generations before. People rose at dawn, worked while light allowed, and rested at darkness. They ate bread, pottage, cheese, and ale almost every day. Meat was a rarity, reserved for festivals and special occasions. They wore the same simple garments year-round, tunics of wool or linen for both men and women, leggings for men, long skirts for women, cloaks and hoods against cold and rain. Life was hard, but not without its pleasures. Feast days brought rest from labor and special foods. Weddings meant celebration. The birth of a healthy child was cause for joy. Even ordinary evenings had their comforts, the warmth of the fire, a bowl of hot pottage, the company of family, the tiredness that comes from honest work and promises sound sleep. The people of Ashford knew each other completely. Families had lived alongside one another for generations. Everyone knew who was strong and who was weak, who was generous and who was miserly, who could be trusted and who required watching. Privacy was an unknown concept. Lives were lived in view of neighbors. But this closeness brought security as well. No one faced hardship alone. When illness struck, neighbors helped. When harvest pressed, everyone worked together. The community held each person in an invisible web of connection and obligation. As evening fell, the village settled into quietness. Fires were banked. Doors were closed. Families gathered in the darkness, saying prayers together before sleep. Outside, the stream continued its eternal murmur. The mill wheel turned. Stars emerged in the darkening sky. The church bell rang for Compline, the final prayer of the day. And Ashford rested, as it had rested every night for hundreds of years, as it would rest for hundreds more. The rooster's crow came just as the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hint of gray. In the house of Thomas Shepherd, Alice stirred from sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening. Beside her, her husband Peter breathed deeply, still asleep. Their 3 children were vague shapes in the darkness, bundled in blankets on the other side of the room. Alice rose carefully, not wanting to wake the others yet. The packed earth floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She felt her way to the hearth in the near total darkness. The embers from last night's fire still glowed faintly, like small red eyes. She knelt and carefully added dry straw and small twigs, blowing gently until flames licked up. The sudden light pushed back the darkness a few feet. She added larger sticks, then a log, building the fire that would warm the house and cook the day's meals. With the fire established, Alice moved to the door and pushed it open. The cool air of early spring rushed in, fresh and clean. The sky was lighter now, though the sun had not yet appeared. A few birds were beginning their morning songs. Across the village, other doors were opening. Other fires were being kindled. The day was beginning. Alice filled a wooden bucket from the barrel by the door and set it near the fire to warm. She would need it for washing and for cooking. From a covered pot, she scooped oats into a cooking vessel and added water, setting it over the fire to make pottage for the family's breakfast. She added a pinch of salt from the small store, kept in a covered jar. Salt was precious, not to be wasted. By the time the pottage was bubbling gently, Peter had risen. He dressed quickly in his work tunic and leggings, splashed cold water on his face from the bucket, and stepped outside to relieve himself. The children began to wake, stretching and yawning. The oldest, Robert, was 12 and already working alongside his father in the fields. Emma was 9, helping her mother with household tasks and learning the skills she would need as a wife. Little William was only 5, still more often playing than working, though he had his small tasks feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, keeping the fire supplied with kindling. They ate their pottage standing or sitting on low stools, using wooden spoons to scoop the warm grain from their bowls. The texture was thick, the taste bland, but filling. Alice had added a bit of dried herb for flavor. They washed it down with weak ale. Water from the well was never drunk, without being brewed into ale first, as everyone knew that plain water could bring sickness. As the family finished eating, the church bell rang for prime, the morning prayer. Peter and Robert gathered the tools they would need for the day's work: a wooden plow, a spade, a sickle. They were planning to work on their strips in the south field, where the winter wheat was growing. The crop needed attention, weeds pulled, damage from birds or animals repaired. The two set out just as the sun was breaking over the eastern horizon, turning the sky from gray to pink to pale blue. Their breath made small clouds in the cool air. They walked the worn path that led from the village to the open fields, joining other men and boys heading to their day's work. The fields of Ashford were arranged in 3 great expanses, each containing hundreds of long, narrow strips. This was the 3-field system that most villages followed. One field would be planted with winter crops, like wheat or rye, sown in autumn and harvested in summer. Another would be planted with spring crops like oats, barley, peas, or beans, sown in spring and harvested in autumn. The 3rd field would lie fallow, resting and recovering its strength. Each year the fields rotated, so that every plot had its turn to rest. Peter's family held strips scattered through all 3 fields. This was by design. If one area did poorly, strips in other areas might do better, spreading the risk. The strips were not straight, but curved slightly, following the turning pattern of the plow. Between strips, unplowed balks of grass provided paths for walking. Peter and Robert found their strip in the south field and set to work. The winter wheat was ankle-high now, green and promising, but weeds grew among it: chickweed, bindweed, thistle. These needed to be pulled by hand to give the wheat room and light to grow. It was tedious work, walking slowly down the strip, bending to pull weeds, moving forward, bending again. The morning passed in this quiet labor. Around them, other families worked their own strips. Occasionally, someone would call out a greeting or a comment, but mostly people worked in silence, saving their breath for the labor. The only sounds were the pull of weeds from earth, the rustle of growing grain, the distant call of birds, the far-off barking of a dog. The sun climbed higher. The air grew warmer. Peter straightened from time to time to ease his back. He looked across the field, a patchwork of green and brown, of cultivated strips and fallow land. Beyond the field, the forest made a dark line against the sky. Above, clouds drifted past like white sheep. It was a good day for working. Not too hot, not raining. Days like this were gifts. At midday, Alice and Emma came to the field, bringing bread and cheese and a jug of ale. The family sat together on the balk between strips, resting and eating. The bread was dark and dense, made from a mixture of wheat and rye flour. The cheese was hard and sharp, made from cow's milk in the dairy at the manor. This midday meal was simple but welcomed, a break in the long work of the day. After eating, Peter lay back on the grass for a few minutes, looking up at the sky. Emma picked wildflowers from the balk, small blue forget-me-nots and white daisies. Robert whittled a stick with his knife, shaving long curls of wood. Alice sat with her hands folded, enjoying the brief rest. Little William chased a butterfly. For this moment, there was no urgency, just the warmth of the sun and the pleasure of rest after labor. But soon enough, Peter sat up. "Back to work," he said mildly. Alice and Emma gathered the lunch things and headed back to the village. Peter and Robert returned to their weeding. The afternoon stretched ahead, long and peaceful. This was the pattern of farming life, long hours of physical labor, punctuated by meals and rest. The work was hard on the body, but easy on the mind. It required no complicated thinking, just steady physical effort. Men who worked the fields developed strong backs and arms, weathered skin, a slow and careful way of moving that conserved energy over the long day. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Peter surveyed their progress. They had cleared perhaps half the strip. Tomorrow they would finish this one and move to another, and then another. There was always more work. The fields demanded constant attention. But this was not a burden so much as the natural rhythm of life. Farming was what Peter's father had done, and his father before him, back through generations lost to memory. They gathered their tools and started back to the village. Other families were doing the same, all moving in the same direction, tired but satisfied. The day's work was done. Evening and rest awaited. The rhythm continued, day after day, season after season, as it always had, as it always would. In the coolness of early morning, before the full heat of the day, Alice prepared to make bread. This was work she did twice each week, baking enough loaves to feed her family for several days. The process was long and required attention, but it was also deeply familiar, almost meditative in its repetition. She began with flour. The sack in the corner held a mixture of wheat and rye, already ground at the mill. Alice scooped several measures into her large wooden mixing bowl. To this she added a good pinch of salt and some warm water, mixing it with her hands until it began to come together. Then came the starter dough, a small piece of old dough that she had saved from the last baking, kept moist under a cloth. This contained the wild yeasts that would make the bread rise. Alice kneaded the dough on the wooden board that served as her work surface. She pushed it away with the heels of her hands, folded it back, turned it, and pushed again. The rhythm was steady and soothing. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. Her arms moved with practiced efficiency. The dough gradually transformed under her hands, becoming smooth and elastic, taking on a life of its own. When the dough felt right, a judgment that came from years of experience, not from any measurement, Alice shaped it into a ball and returned it to the bowl. She covered it with a cloth and set it near the fire where the warmth would encourage it to rise. Now came the waiting. The dough would need several hours to double in size. In the meantime, Alice turned to other tasks. Emma sat in the doorway with a basket of wool between her knees, carding it with 2 flat wooden paddles studded with short metal wires. This was one of the many steps in the long process of turning raw wool into thread and eventually into cloth. The carding aligned the wool fibers, removing tangles and preparing the wool for spinning. The wool had come from the Lord's sheep, shorn in late spring. As part of their obligations, several village women had spent days washing the fleeces in the stream, spreading them to dry, and then dividing them among the households. Each family received a portion appropriate to their size and needs. Some of this wool would be spun and woven into cloth for their own use. Some would be returned to the manor as rent. Emma worked the wool between the cards, dragging one across the other. The motion made a soft scritching sound. Gradually, the tangled wool became smooth and fluffy, ready for spinning. It was tedious work, but Emma didn't mind. She could sit in the sun, watch the village go by, and let her hands move automatically. Her mother had taught her to card when she was only 6. Now, at 9, her hands were quick and sure. Inside, Alice checked her dough. It had risen nicely, pushing against the cloth that covered it. She punched it down, kneaded it briefly, and shaped it into 2 round loaves. These she placed on a wooden board dusted with flour. Again, she covered them and set them to rise once more. This second rising would be shorter, perhaps an hour. While the bread rose, Alice turned to mending. She kept a basket of items that needed attention, a tunic with a torn hem, leggings with a hole at the knee, a hood with a frayed edge. She threaded a bone needle with thread she had spun herself and began to repair the tunic. Her stitches were small and neat, almost invisible. Cloth was too valuable to discard because of minor damage. Everything was mended, used until it literally fell apart, and even then, the pieces might be saved as rags or patches. The room was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the small sounds of work. Outside, a hen clucked contentedly. Someone passed by the house, their footsteps soft on the packed earth. The morning sun slanted through the open door, making a bright rectangle on the floor. When the loaves had risen again, Alice prepared to bake. The village had a communal oven, a large dome-shaped structure built of clay and stone near the church. Several families shared the expense of heating it, and they took turns using it on baking days. Today was Alice's turn, along with 2 other households. Alice carried her loaves carefully to the oven. Another woman, Margaret, was already there, stoking the fire that heated the oven's interior. The oven had been fired early in the morning. Now the flames had died down, and Margaret was raking out the coals and ashes, leaving the oven's interior clean and blazingly hot. The women tested the temperature by tossing a handful of flour onto the oven floor. It should brown but not blacken. That meant the heat was right. Satisfied, they used long wooden paddles to slide their loaves onto the hot stone floor of the oven. Alice's 2 loaves went in alongside Margaret's 3 and another woman's 4. The door of the oven was closed, sealing in the heat. Now came another wait. The bread would bake for perhaps an hour. The women settled nearby to talk and work on hand projects they had brought. Margaret was hemming a new linen shift. The third woman, Beatrice, was spinning wool on a drop spindle, the weight twirling as she drew out the thread. They talked of small things, whose children were ailing, whose cow had calved, what the weather might do, who had seen what at the market in the nearby town. The conversation was easy and meandering, requiring no great attention. They had known each other all their lives. They had grown up together, married within a few years of each other, born their children together. They knew each other's stories so well that few words were needed to convey much. The smell of baking bread began to drift from the oven, warm, yeasty, delicious. It was one of the finest smells in the world, a smell that meant home and comfort and sustenance. After a time, Margaret opened the oven door and checked the loaves. The crusts were golden brown, firm to the tap. They were done. Using the long paddles again, the women removed the loaves and set them to cool on a wooden rack. Alice's loaves were beautiful, round, and golden, with small cracks in the crust where steam had escaped. She felt the small satisfaction that comes from work well done. This bread would feed her family for days. It was good bread, honest bread, made with her own hands from grain her family had grown. Back at home, Alice set the loaves on a shelf, covering them with a cloth to keep them clean. She cut a thick slice from one, still warm, and spread it with butter she had churned 2 days before. She ate it standing by the fire, savoring the taste. Fresh bread was a simple pleasure, but no less real for its simplicity. The rest of the day passed in other small tasks. There was always something that needed doing. Alice swept the floor, refreshed the rushes, washed wooden bowls and spoons, fed the chickens, weeded the garden, trimmed the wick on the rushlight, checked that the flour sack was sealed against mice. None of these tasks was large or important in itself, but together they made up the work of maintaining a household. Emma, having finished her carding, began to spin the wool. She used a simple drop spindle, a wooden shaft with a disc near one end that provided weight and momentum. She attached a few fibers from her carded wool to the spindle, set it spinning with a twist of her fingers, and slowly drew out more fibers, letting them twist into thread. The spindle spun and dropped, pulled by gravity, twisting the wool as it went. When it reached the ground, Emma wound the newly spun thread around the shaft and began again. This, too, was meditative work. The rhythm was hypnotic: attach, twist, draw, wind, repeat. The spindle hummed as it spun. The thread grew steadily longer. Emma could spin and let her mind wander, thinking of nothing in particular. Sometimes she sang quietly to herself, old songs her mother had taught her. By evening, Alice had accomplished a dozen small tasks. None was dramatic or noteworthy, but the house was clean, the family was fed, the work was advancing steadily. This was the quiet satisfaction of domestic life, not grand achievements, but the steady maintenance of home and family. As twilight fell, Peter and Robert returned from the fields. Alice served bread and cheese and onions, with ale to drink. They ate together by the fire, tired and hungry. The bread was still good and fresh, the butter rich. After eating, they sat quietly for a while. Peter carved a new tool handle from a piece of ash wood. Robert practiced his letters in the dirt floor with a stick he was learning to read a little from the priest. Alice spun more wool. Emma and William played a simple game with pebbles. Gradually, as darkness deepened, they prepared for sleep. The fire was banked, the door secured. Prayers were said. They lay down on their straw mattresses, pulling woolen blankets over themselves. Outside, the village settled into silence. Another day had passed in the eternal rhythm of work and rest, making and tending, small tasks repeated endlessly until they became the fabric of a life. Once each week, on Saturday, the town of Milford held its market. Milford was larger than Ashford, a proper town with several hundred inhabitants, stone walls remaining from an earlier era, and a weekly market that drew people from villages for miles around. Alice and Peter made the journey to Milford, perhaps once a month, bringing items to sell and hoping to buy things they could not make themselves. On this particular Saturday in June, Alice rose even earlier than usual. She had eggs to sell more than her family could use, and butter she had churned, and a length of linen cloth she had woven over the winter months. These would bring a few pennies. With those pennies, she hoped to buy iron needles, which lasted far longer than the bone needles she usually used, and perhaps some honey, which was a luxury but so good on bread. Peter would go with her. They would take the cart, pulled by their old donkey, a patient beast named Thistle. Robert would stay behind to watch the younger children and tend to the house and animals. It would be a long day, 2 hours walking to Milford, time at the market, 2 hours back, but also a break from routine, a chance to see a bit more of the world. They set out just as the sky was beginning to lighten. Thistle, plodding steadily along the rutted track that served as the road. Alice walked beside the cart. Peter led the donkey. The morning was cool and fresh. Birds sang from every hedge. The fields they passed were green with growing crops. Other travelers appeared on the road as the morning progressed, people walking to market, a monk riding a mule, a merchant with a pack train of goods. Milford came into view as they crested a hill, a cluster of buildings, larger and more substantial than Ashford. The church tower rose above the other structures. Smoke from many fires hazed the air. As they drew closer, the road became more crowded. Everyone was heading to market. The marketplace occupied a large square near the center of town. By the time Alice and Peter arrived, the square was already filling with people. Farmers and craftspeople were setting up their wares on tables or on cloths spread on the ground. The air buzzed with conversation and commerce. Alice found a spot and arranged her goods. The eggs she placed carefully in a basket lined with straw. The butter, wrapped in clean linen, went beside them. The length of linen cloth she draped over the edge of the cart where people could see its quality. Then she settled in to wait for customers. The marketplace was a world unto itself, a concentration of activity and variety that contrasted sharply with the quiet predictability of village life. Alice looked around with interest, as she always did, at the range of goods and people. At one stall, a woman sold bread and honey cakes. At another, a man offered apples from storage last year's harvest, somewhat wrinkled, but still good. A butcher had set up a temporary table where he sold cuts of pork and mutton, the meat attracting flies that he waved away periodically. A fishmonger had brought fresh fish from the river, laid out on a bed of cool grass. A cheese seller displayed rounds of hard yellow cheese. Beyond food, other goods were available. A cobbler repaired and sold shoes. A potter had bowls, jugs, and cooking vessels. A peddler displayed ribbons, buttons, needles, pins, thread, and other small notions. A man sold rope and baskets. Another offered wooden spoons, bowls, and platters, each one hand-carved. The variety was overwhelming compared to the limited goods available in the village. Here you could find things from farther away, salt from the coast, perhaps, or wool dyed with expensive imported colors, or iron tools made by specialized craftsmen. The market connected the local economy to wider trade networks, bringing goods from town to village and village products to town. People moved through the market in a steady stream, examining goods, asking prices, bargaining, buying. Alice watched them, farmers she recognized from nearby villages, town dwellers she did not know, occasionally a wealthier person in finer clothes. Children darted through the crowd, dogs scavenged for scraps. A juggler performed near the church, hoping for coins. A woman stopped at Alice's spot and examined the linen cloth, running it between her fingers to judge the quality of the weave. "How much?" she asked. Alice named her price. The woman countered with a lower offer. They negotiated calmly, arriving eventually at a price between the two. Coins changed hands, small silver pennies, thin and worn. Alice tucked them carefully into the leather purse that hung from her belt. The woman took the cloth and moved on. Alice felt satisfaction. That cloth had represented months of work, spinning the flax into thread in the evenings, weaving it on her small loom bit by bit. Now it was converted into coins that could buy other necessities. Over the next hour, Alice sold all her eggs and most of her butter. Each sale added a few more coins to her purse. It was not wealth, far from it, but it was something, a small surplus that gave her family a tiny bit more security. When the selling was done, Alice and Peter walked through the market themselves, looking at what was available. Peter stopped at the tool cellar and examined some iron plowshares. The prices were too high, but he made note of them for future reference. Alice went to the peddler's stall and bought a packet of iron needles, running her fingers over them to feel their sharpness and strength. She also bought a small pot of honey, which cost more than she liked but would be such a treat. They paused to watch the juggler for a few minutes. He was keeping 5 leather balls in the air at once, his hands moving in a blur. A small crowd had gathered. When he finished his performance, he passed his hat for coins. Peter dropped in a halfpenny. The juggler nodded his thanks. Near the church, a sermon was being preached by a traveling friar. He stood on the church steps, his brown robe worn and dusty, his voice ringing out as he spoke of sin and repentance. Some people stopped to listen. Others passed by without pausing. Peter and Alice moved on. They had heard many such sermons. At midday, they found a place to sit on a low wall and ate the bread and cheese they had brought for lunch. The market swirled around them, a river of people and goods and voices. It was exhausting in its way, this concentration of activity. Alice found herself looking forward to the quiet of home. But the market also had its pleasures. There was something energizing about being among so many people, seeing new faces, hearing news from other areas. A woman from a village 10 miles away told of a wedding that had been celebrated there. A merchant mentioned that the harvest in the south had been poor last year, which meant grain prices might rise. A town dweller complained about the condition of the roads. Each conversation added a small piece to Alice's understanding of the wider world. They stayed until mid-afternoon, then began the journey home. Thistle, unburdened by the goods they had sold, moved a bit more briskly. The sun was warm on their backs. The road was less crowded now, most market-goers having already headed home. They talked little on the return journey, each lost in their own thoughts. Alice thought about the needles in her purse, already planning the mending she could do with them. Peter thought about the plowshares, calculating whether they might afford one before autumn plowing. Both felt the pleasant tiredness that comes from a long day on their feet. By the time they reached Ashford, the sun was lowering toward the horizon. Robert had kept the fire going and had prepared a simple meal of pottage. The younger children ran out to greet them. Alice brought out the honey and spread it on bread for everyone, a special treat that made the children's eyes widen. The sweetness was intense and delicious, so different from their usual plain fare. That evening, sitting by the fire, Alice felt content. The market day had been successful. They had sold their surplus, bought needed items, and still had a few coins left over. These coins she would save, adding them to the small store hidden in a crack in the wall behind the loose stone. This was their security, their hedge against disaster. If the harvest failed, if illness struck, if some emergency arose, those saved pennies might make the difference between survival and catastrophe. Outside, darkness gathered. The village settled into its nightly quiet. Alice stoked the fire one last time before bed, watching the flames dance. Tomorrow was Sunday, a day of rest, a day for church. But tonight she was simply tired and satisfied, ready for sleep. The market, with its noise and crowds and commerce, already seemed distant, like something from another world. This was her real world, the fire, the family, the small familiar room. And it was enough. Summer evenings in Ashford had a special quality. The long days stretched late into the evening, and after the heat of the afternoon, the cooling air brought relief. This was a time when work slowed, when people emerged from their houses to enjoy the gentler hours before darkness. On this particular evening in July, the village green became a gathering place. Children played a game involving a stick and a leather ball, running and shouting with the boundless energy of youth. Dogs joined in, barking and chasing. Younger children too small for the game played at the edge, making mud pies or collecting stones. Several women sat together on the grass, continuing their work even as they socialized. Alice was among them, her spindle twirling as she spun wool into thread. Beside her, Margaret knitted a stocking on 4 wooden needles, the stitches small and even. Beatrice hemmed a shirt. Their hands moved automatically, allowing their attention to focus on conversation. They talked of everyday things. Margaret mentioned that her daughter had felt the baby move for the first time that day she was 4 months along with her first child. The other women offered advice, sharing their own experiences of pregnancy and childbirth. Beatrice's oldest son had found work with the blacksmith as an apprentice, which was good fortune. He would learn a valuable trade. Alice shared the news from market day, mentioning that grain prices might rise. Their conversation was gentle and meandering, full of pauses and comfortable silences. They had all known each other since childhood. They had played together as girls, married within a few years of one another, raised their children side by side. Their lives were intertwined in countless ways. They attended the same church, celebrated the same festivals, helped each other in times of need. This web of connection and mutual support was the foundation of village life. Nearby, several men sat on the bench outside the alehouse, drinking weak ale and talking in low voices. Peter was among them. The conversation was desultory talk of crops and weather, animals and work. Someone mentioned seeing a deer at the edge of the forest. Another described a problem with his plow that the blacksmith had solved. They spoke slowly, with long pauses between sentences, watching the children play, savoring the rest after a long day's work. The alehouse itself was a simple structure, just a cottage like any other, but the family who lived there brewed extra ale and sold it to neighbors. Inside, the alewife, Joan, was drawing ale from a large barrel into wooden cups and bowls. The ale was thin and slightly sour, but it was wet and cool and mildly intoxicating. Men drank it at the end of the workday, not to become drunk that was frowned upon, but simply to relax and enjoy the fellowship of neighbors. Father Benedict emerged from the church, his day's duties complete. He walked slowly toward the green, nodding greetings to parishioners. The villagers respected their priest. He was educated, gentle, patient with their faults. He did not live high above them. His house was simple, his clothes worn, his food plain. He understood their lives because he shared them, at least in poverty, if not in labor. He paused to watch the children's game, smiling at their energy. Young Robert saw him and ran over. "Father, is it true that Jerusalem is so far away you could walk for a year and not reach it?" Robert had been learning about the Crusades in his lessons. Father Benedict considered. "Further than that, my son, perhaps 2 years or more, walking every day. It is at the very edge of the world as we know it." Robert's eyes widened. The scale was hard to imagine. His entire world consisted of Ashford and the few surrounding villages, with Milford seeming almost impossibly distant at 2 hours' walk. The idea of a journey lasting years was beyond comprehension. "Have you ever traveled far, Father?" Robert asked. "I have been as far as Lincoln," the priest replied. "That took 4 days on horseback. I saw the cathedral there, a great stone church far larger than our street Mary's. But I confess I was glad to return home. These fields and this village are dear to me." As the sun sank lower, the quality of light changed. Everything was bathed in golden glow, the timber houses, the green grass, the stone church. Shadows grew longer. Swallows swooped through the air, catching insects. Somewhere, a nightingale began its evening song. The children's game wound down as they grew tired. They drifted back to their families. Mothers called them to wash faces and hands at the well before supper. The women gathered their handiwork and stood, stretching stiff limbs. The men finished their ale and prepared to head home, but no one was in a great hurry. The evening was too pleasant to rush. People moved slowly, stopping for a word here and there, enjoying the lingering light. This was one of the rhythms of medieval life, the understanding that some moments were for work and some for rest, and the evening hours, especially in summer, were a time to breathe and simply be. Alice returned to her house to find Emma had already started preparing supper. There was bread from yesterday's baking, cheese, onions from the garden, and a bit of bacon, a rare treat that Peter had received as part of his work on the Lord's land. Emma sliced the bacon thin and fried it in a pan over the fire. The smell was wonderful, rich and savory. They would have a feast tonight. The family gathered to eat. Everyone was in good spirits. The work of the day was done. The evening was pleasant. The food was better than usual. They ate slowly, savoring each bite. Little William chattered about the game they had played on the green. Emma described the new calf born that morning to one of the village cows. Robert talked about his conversation with Father Benedict. After eating, they sat outside their door, enjoying the last of the daylight. The sky was deepening from blue to purple. Stars were beginning to appear. First one, then several, then too many to count. The moon rose, nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows. Peter brought out a small wooden flute he had carved and played a simple tune. His skill was limited, but the music was pleasant enough, an old melody passed down through generations, the kind of tune that everyone knew but no one quite remembered learning. Alice hummed along. The children listened, drowsy after their active evening. Across the village, other families were doing much the same, sitting outside in the cooling air, talking quietly, watching the night arrive. There was no artificial light, except the occasional glow of a fire through an open door. The darkness that came was complete and natural, bringing with it a stillness that encouraged sleep. The church bell rang for Compline, the last prayer of the day. Father Benedict would be saying the office in the empty church, his voice the only sound in that stone space. The bell's sound carried across the village, a reminder of the spiritual rhythm that underlay all of daily life. The medieval world was saturated with religion. Every day was marked by the canonical hours. Every important life event, birth, marriage, death, was marked by religious ceremony. Faith was not separate from ordinary life, but woven through it. One by one, families went inside and closed their doors. Fires were banked, leaving just enough embers to rekindle easily in the morning. Prayers were said, simple prayers, asking for protection through the night, for health, for the safety of loved ones, for good weather and successful harvests. Alice tucked the younger children into bed, covering them with blankets even though the night was warm habit and a mother's instinct to protect. They fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from their day of playing. Robert banked the fire and closed the shutters on the windows. Peter checked that the door was securely barred. The family lay down to sleep, Peter and Alice on one straw mattress, the children on another. The house was dark and quiet. Outside, the village was settling into complete silence. The only sounds were natural ones, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small animal in the thatch, the distant bark of a dog. Alice lay awake for a few minutes, listening to the breathing of her sleeping family. She thought about nothing in particular, just felt the tiredness in her body, the satisfaction of another day completed, the security of home and family. Her life was not easy. It was filled with work and worry, with a constant effort of survival. But it was also filled with these moments, peaceful evenings, good food, the company of those she loved. She said a final prayer, silently, and let herself drift towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring more work, but that was for tomorrow. Tonight, all was well. The village slept under the stars, as it had slept for generations, as it would sleep for generations to come. The rhythm continued, eternal and reassuring, day into day again. Some 5 miles from Ashford stood the monastery of Street Benedict, a walled compound of stone buildings where 40 monks lived, lives devoted to prayer and work. The monastery had stood for nearly 300 years, founded by a wealthy nobleman seeking to ensure prayers for his soul after death. Over the centuries, it had grown through gifts and bequests until it owned extensive lands and had become an important institution in the region. Brother Thomas had lived in the monastery for 15 years, having entered as a young man of 18. Now, 33, he was fully formed in the monastic life, his days structured by the ancient rhythm of the divine office, the cycle of prayers that marked every 3 hours, pulling him from sleep in the deepest night and continuing until evening. The monastery's day began in darkness. At 2 a.m, a bell rang for matins. Brother Thomas woke from his brief sleep in the dormitory, a long room lined with narrow beds where the monks slept in their robes, ready to rise instantly when called. He and his brothers filed silently down the night stairs into the church. The church was the heart of the monastery, a stone building with high arches and small windows. At this hour it was almost completely dark, lit only by a few candles on the altar. The monks took their places in the choir stalls, standing in 2 rows facing each other. Brother Thomas could barely see the forms of his brothers in the dimness, but he knew exactly where each one stood. They had done this same ritual every night for years. The abbot began the opening prayer. Then came the psalms, chanted in Latin in the ancient plain chant style. The voices rose and fell in the darkness, weaving together in a sound that was both melancholy and comforting. Brother Thomas knew these psalms by heart. His voice joined the others automatically, his mind barely engaged. This was prayer as work, as offering, as duty. It was not meant to be emotional, but rather faithful, the steadfast fulfillment of an obligation to pray without ceasing. The service lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, the monks filed back to the dormitory and lay down again to sleep for a few more hours. Brother Thomas pulled his thin blanket over himself and closed his eyes. The stone walls held the cold even in summer, but he was used to discomfort. The monastic life demanded acceptance of hardship as a form of discipline, a way of shaping the soul. At dawn, the bell rang again for lauds. Again the monks filed to the church. This time the sky was beginning to lighten, and gray light filtered through the windows. The service followed the same pattern: psalms, prayers, scripture readings. Brother Thomas's stomach was empty. They would not eat until after the morning chapter meeting. After Lauds came prime, the prayer for the first hour. Then the community gathered in the chapter house for the daily meeting. Here, practical matters were discussed, work assignments, problems that needed attention, discipline for brothers who had broken rules. The abbot read a chapter from the Rule of Street, Benedict, the guide for monastic life, written centuries before. Today's reading was about humility. The first degree of humility is to keep the fear of God before one's eyes at all times and never to forget it. Brother Thomas listened with half his attention. He had heard these readings countless times. They were good and true, but familiarity had dulled their edge. His mind wandered to the work he would do today. He was assigned to the scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts. After chapter, the monks finally broke their fast with a simple meal: bread, cheese, and weak ale. They ate in silence in the refectory, while one brother read aloud from the lives of the saints. The reading was meant to provide spiritual nourishment while they took physical food. Brother Thomas chewed his bread slowly, making it last. The cheese was good, sharp, and salty. He allowed himself to enjoy it, though he knew attachment to pleasure in food was a form of weakness. Then came the work of the day. Brother Thomas went to the scriptorium, a dedicated room with good light from large windows. Several monks worked here, each at his own desk. The scriptorium was one of the few places where silence was not absolute. Monks could speak when necessary about the work, though they were encouraged to communicate by sign language when possible. Brother Thomas sat at his desk, which was angled to catch the best light. Before him was a half-finished manuscript, a copy of the Gospel of Matthew. The original text was propped on a reading stand. His materials were laid out carefully: parchment sheets, several quills sharpened to fine points, pots of ink in black and red, a knife for scraping mistakes, a ruler for keeping lines straight. Copying manuscripts was exacting work that required intense concentration. Brother Thomas dipped his quill and began to write in the clear, regular hand he had developed over years of practice. The Latin text flowed onto the page: Liber generationis, Isu, Christi filii, David, filii Abraham. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Each letter had to be formed correctly. The spacing had to be even. Lines had to be straight. Any error meant scraping away the ink and starting that section again. Parchment was expensive, made from sheep or goat skin that had been scraped, stretched, and dried, so mistakes were to be avoided at all costs. Brother Thomas worked steadily, stopping occasionally to sharpen his quill or to rest his hand. The work was tiring, both mentally and physically. His back ached from bending over the desk. His eyes strained to see the letters clearly. His fingers cramped from gripping the quill, but there was also satisfaction in the work. Each page completed was a small victory. Each manuscript finished was a contribution to preserving sacred knowledge. Around him, other monks worked on their own projects. Brother William was copying a psalter. Brother John was working on an herbal, a book describing medicinal plants. Brother Peter, the most skilled illuminator, was adding decorative initial letters to a book of hours, painting them with brilliant colors made from ground minerals and plant dyes. The occasional scratch of quills on parchment and the rustle of turning pages were the only sounds. At midday, the bell rang for sext. Work stopped immediately. Brother Thomas cleaned his quill, stoppered his ink, and made his way to the church. The noon office was brief, but it marked the middle of the day, a pause for recollection and prayer. After sext came dinner, the main meal of the day. Dinner was more substantial than breakfast: a vegetable pottage with chunks of bread, a small piece of fish, cheese, and ale. The monks ate in continued silence while another brother read from St. Augustine. Brother Thomas ate slowly, mindful of each bite. The rule of Street Benedict prescribed moderation in all things, including eating. Gluttony was a sin, but so was the pride of excessive asceticism. The middle way was best. After dinner came a brief rest period. Some monks napped. Others walked in the cloister, the covered walkway that surrounded the central courtyard. Brother Thomas walked, hands clasped behind his back, pacing the familiar stone path. The cloister garden was planted with herbs and flowers. Bees hummed among the blossoms. A fountain splashed gently in the center. This was meant to be a place of peace, conducive to meditation and prayer. But Brother Thomas found his mind wandering to mundane concerns. He thought about the manuscript he was working on, calculating how many more days it would take to finish. He thought about a pain in his tooth that had troubled him that morning. He thought about a disagreement he had witnessed between two brothers at breakfast. He tried to pull his mind back to prayer, but it drifted again. This was the constant struggle of monastic life, the effort to maintain spiritual focus in the face of the mind's tendency to wander. The afternoon was given to more work. Brother Thomas returned to the scriptorium and continued copying. The light was best in the afternoon, making it easier to see the fine details of the letters. He worked for several hours, making good progress. By the time the bell rang for Vespers, he had completed 2 full pages a productive day. Vespers, the evening prayer, was one of the most beautiful services of the day. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the church windows. The chant seemed to take on extra resonance. Brother Thomas sang with more heart than he had in the middle of the night, feeling genuinely grateful for the day, for the work accomplished, for the community of his brothers. After Vespers came supper, a light meal of bread, cheese, and fruit. Then a period of recreation, when monks could talk freely. Brother Thomas sat with several other brothers in the cloister, enjoying the evening air. They talked about small things, a fox that had been seen in the orchard, a problem with the roof that needed repair. News from the village brought by a visitor. It was pleasant to use his voice after hours of silence, to laugh at a mild joke, to be among friends. At dusk, the bell rang for Compline. The final prayer. The monks processed once more to the church. This service had a feeling of ending, of completion. After Compline, the great silence began, no speaking at all until after the morning chapter meeting. The monks would sleep, wake for matins, sleep again, and begin a new day. The cycle was eternal. Brother Thomas climbed the stairs to the dormitory. He removed his shoes, but slept otherwise fully clothed. He lay down on his narrow bed, arranged his blanket, and prepared for sleep. His body was tired. His mind was quiet. He said a brief prayer of thanksgiving and then allowed himself to drift off. The monastery settled into nighttime stillness. The church stood dark and empty. The cloister was silent. The dormitory held 40 sleeping forms. Outside, beyond the monastery walls, the world went on: farmers sleeping in their cottages, lords in their castles, merchants on the roads. But inside these walls, time moved differently. The monks were separate, dedicated to a life of prayer and work, maintaining a rhythm that had persisted for centuries and would, God willing, persist for centuries more. It was a life of discipline and renunciation, but also of peace and purpose. Brother Thomas, drifting toward sleep, felt no regrets. This was the life he had chosen, and he was content. The countryside surrounding Ashford lay under the deep darkness of a moonless night in October. The harvest was complete. The fields had been gleaned, the last grain collected, the stubble plowed under in preparation for winter planting. The work that had driven the rhythm of summer and early autumn had slowed. Now, in the lengthening nights, there was time for rest. In the shepherd's cottage at the far edge of the village fields, old William sat by his fire. He was past 60, an age few reached, and his long life had been spent almost entirely in the company of sheep. He lived alone now. His wife had died 3 years before. His children were grown and living in their own households. but he was not lonely. The solitude suited him. He had his fire, his dog, his memories, and the silent company of the sheep in the nearby fold. The cottage was small, just a single room with a hearth and a sleeping platform. The walls were thick stone, the roof good thatch. It kept out the wind and most of the rain. William needed little more. His possessions were few: a pot for cooking, a bowl and spoon, a blanket, a spare tunic, a shepherd's crook worn smooth by decades of use, a small knife. He had a stool to sit on and a rough table for preparing food. That was enough. He sat now with his old dog, Bracken, lying at his feet. The fire burned low, just enough to keep away the chill. William was not reading, he had never learned, but simply sitting, looking into the flames, his mind wandering through the pathways of memory. He thought about the lambing season last spring. It had been difficult. Cold rains had come just as the ewes were giving birth, and several lambs had died despite his best efforts to warm them. But most had survived, and now they were grown sheep, thick with wool, ready for winter. He thought about the good grass that year, the way the flock had fattened. He thought about the summer when he had moved the sheep to higher pasture, spending weeks in a rough shelter on the hills, alone except for Bracken and the sheep. The silence of the night was complete. No wind stirred. No rain fell. The darkness beyond the fire's glow was absolute. William rose and opened the door to look out. The night swallowed everything. He could barely see to the nearby fold where the sheep rested, but he could hear them, the occasional soft baa, the rustle of movement, the sound of their breathing. They were safe. All was well. He stepped outside for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Gradually, shapes emerged from the darkness, the darker bulk of the fold, the line of the hedge, the distant mass of the forest. Above, the sky was thick with stars, more than could ever be counted. William looked up at them, as he had done thousands of times before. He knew the patterns, the plow, the bear, the milky river that ran across the heavens. He knew how they wheeled slowly through the year, how their positions marked the passing seasons. The stars were unchanging, eternal. Kingdoms might rise and fall, harvests might succeed or fail. People were born and died, but the stars remained. There was comfort in that constancy. William felt small beneath them, but not insignificant. He was part of the pattern, one life in an endless succession, doing work that had been done before him and would be done after. A fox called from somewhere in the darkness, a sharp, eerie cry. Bracken raised his head, listening, but did not bark. He knew the difference between a threat and something passing through. William listened too, hearing in that cry the wildness that lay just beyond the ordered world of fields and flocks. The forest was home to deer and boar, foxes and badgers, wolves perhaps in the deep places. The wild was never far away. He went back inside, closing the door against the cold. He added another piece of wood to the fire, watching sparks rise up and vanish. He sat again, feeling the warmth on his face. Bracken sighed and settled back to sleep. William thought about the years stretching behind him. He had been born in this village, had known no other life. He remembered being a boy, learning the shepherd's craft from his father. He remembered his wedding day, the birth of his children, the slow accumulation of years. He remembered friends now dead, sheep that had lived their spans and gone to slaughter, winters that had tested him, and summers that had blessed him. He was content. His life had not been extraordinary. He had never traveled further than the market town. He could not read or write. He had never owned more than could fit in this small cottage. But he had done his work well. He had kept the sheep safe. He had provided wool for clothing and meat for the table. He had lived according to the rhythms of nature and season. That was enough. That was everything. Gradually, his eyes grew heavy. The fire burned lower. He rose and climbed onto the sleeping platform, pulling his blanket around himself. Bracken jumped up and curled at his feet. William said a brief prayer, simple words asking for protection through the night, and then let himself sink into sleep. Outside, the night deepened. The countryside lay still under the stars. In the fields, nothing moved. The forest was silent. The sheep slept in their fold, safe from predators, warm against each other's wool. The stream that ran past the village murmured softly, the only sound in all the darkness. Miles away, in the monastery, the monks woke for matins and filed to the church to sing their prayers. In the village, families slept in their cottages. In the manor house, the lord and lady rested in their chamber. The whole landscape was given over to sleep and silence. This was the deep quiet of the medieval night, unbroken by artificial light or sound. The darkness was complete, primitive, the same darkness that had fallen on this land since the beginning of time. In that darkness, people slept and trusted that dawn would come again. They lived close to the rhythms of day and night, summer and winter, life and death. They accepted these rhythms as the natural order of things. William slept deeply, dreamlessly. His breathing was slow and regular. His face in sleep was peaceful, lined with years but not troubled. He had lived well. When his time came soon, perhaps, given his age, he would die as he had lived, simply and without complaint. But that time was not yet. For now, he slept, and the night held him gently. The stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of hours. Slowly, imperceptibly, the earth turned toward the sun. Far to the east, the first faint hint of gray appeared on the horizon, not yet dawn, but the promise of dawn. The night was passing. Morning would come. But for now, all was stillness. The countryside slept. The darkness reigned. And in that darkness, there was peace, the peace of the natural world, continuing its eternal cycles, indifferent to human concerns, simply being. The trees stood patient. The streams flowed on. The earth turned, and William, shepherd, slept. The wheel of the year turned slowly, season following season in the eternal pattern. We have walked through a day in medieval life, and then another, seeing the quiet rhythms that structured existence in those distant centuries. Now, as our journey comes to its close, let us rest a moment and reflect on what we have witnessed. The medieval world was a world of slowness. Time moved at the pace of footsteps, of ox carts on dirt roads, of seasons unfolding. There was no hurry, because hurrying served no purpose. The grain would grow at its own pace. The sun would set when it was ready. Work was done steadily, without rush, because it would need to be done again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after that, as long as life continued. It was a world of repetition. The same tasks performed daily, drawing water, tending fire, grinding grain, mending clothes. The same fields plowed each year, the same prayers spoken at the same hours. This repetition was not boring, but comforting. It provided structure and meaning. Each day was known, predictable, secure. It was a world lived close to the earth. People touched soil daily, planting and weeding and harvesting. They knew weather intimately, how clouds foretold rain, how wind smelled different in different seasons, how frost formed on fall mornings. They knew animals, the personalities of individual cows and sheep, the signs of sickness in livestock, the habits of wild creatures. They knew plants, which were good to eat, which healed, which harmed, when each one grew and seeded. It was a world of community. Privacy barely existed. Lives were lived in sight and knowledge of neighbors, but this meant no one faced hardship alone. When someone needed help, help came. When there was cause to celebrate, everyone celebrated together. The bonds that connected people were visible and strong. It was a world of faith. Religion was not separate from daily life, but woven through it. Prayers marked the hours. Saints' days marked the calendar. The church stood at the center of every village, its bells calling, its priest guiding. People believed in heaven and hell, in sin and redemption, in the constant presence of the divine. This belief gave meaning to suffering and hope in hardship. Was it a good life? By our standards, it was hard, filled with physical labor, limited in comfort, constrained by poverty. Few people traveled far from home. Few learned to read. Medicine was primitive. Many children died young. Life expectancy was short. Injustice and inequality were built into the social structure. And yet, within those constraints, people found contentment. They found joy in simple pleasures, fresh bread, a warm fire, the company of loved ones. They found satisfaction in work well done. They found meaning in faith and community. They lived lives that, while limited, were complete. As we leave this medieval world and return to our own time, we might carry with us some of what we have witnessed: the value of slowness in a hurried age, the comfort of routine and repetition, the importance of community and connection, the peace that comes from living close to natural rhythms. The countryside is dark now in our imagination, as it was in reality on those medieval nights. The villages are silent, the fields rest, the forests stand patient, the streams flow on, constant and eternal. In the cottage, the fire has burned to embers. In the monastery, the monks sleep between prayers. In the manor house, the Lord's family rests in their chambers. Throughout the landscape, people sleep, trusting in the dawn. The stars wheel overhead, as they have always wheeled, as they always will. The earth turns toward morning, and in the darkness there is peace, the deep peace of a world at rest, of work completed, of sleep earned and taken. Let us rest now, too, carried on the gentle rhythms of those distant days. Let us breathe slowly, matching our breath to the pace of medieval time. Let us feel the weight of honest tiredness, the satisfaction of a day completed, the security of shelter and family. The fire burns low. The darkness is soft. The night holds us gently. There is nothing that must be done, nowhere we must go. We are simply here, in this moment, at peace. The past is distant, but not gone. Those medieval days live on in the stones of old churches, in the patterns of ancient fields, in the rhythms we still feel when we slow down enough to notice them. The people who lived those lives are dust now, but their work continues in the landscape they shaped, in the traditions they passed down, in the quiet wisdom of living according to nature's pace. Let their peace be our peace tonight. Let their rest be our rest. Let the centuries fall away, and let us find in their simple patterns a template for our own quieting. The night deepens. The stars shine. The world sleeps. And we, too, can sleep, carried gently into dreams by the soft rhythms of a quieter time. There is nothing to fear, nothing to solve, nothing to accomplish. There is only this moment of rest, this gift of darkness and silence, this gentle descent into sleep. Let go of the day's concerns. Let go of tomorrow's worries. Let go of the need to think or plan or figure out. Simply rest, simply breathe, simply be. The medieval night surrounds us, soft and complete. The cottage walls keep out the cold. The fire's embers glow softly. The blanket is rough but warm. The straw mattress, though hard, is familiar and sufficient. This is enough. This is everything. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Let the centuries wrap around you like a blanket. Let the quiet of those distant days settle into your bones. Let the peace of a world without hurry, without noise, without endless demands, fill you completely. The wheel of the year turns, the seasons cycle. Life goes on in its eternal pattern, and we are part of it, connected to all who have lived before and all who will live after. We are not alone. We are held in the great pattern of existence, safe and complete. Sleep now. The night is long and kind. The darkness is gentle, and morning, when it comes, will bring its own quiet gifts, but that is for later. For now, there is only sleep, deep and dreamless and healing. Rest in the medieval night. Rest in the peace of simple things. Rest in the knowledge that you are safe, you are held, you are enough. Sleep softly. Sleep well. Sleep long. Good night. Thank you for listening. I hope this calm journey helped you rest. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams.